The day the smiles died, Christopher wearily prodded his spoon into the stew, fatigue settling in after a week of feasting. Alongside Adam, Robin, and his 5 guards, they sat outside their tents, silently breaking their fast around a warmed pot of humble stew. Maybe joining the lists would have been a wiser choice if only to stay fit. Today marked the final day of feasting, with the last jousts scheduled for this afternoon. It would prevent him from growing fat, unlike Robin, who seemed a bit rounder, though it wasn't a major concern given his age. As the majority of the nobles prepared to leave Harrenhal on the morrow, Christopher contemplated his own destination. The dismantling of lavish tents and pavilions had already begun, signaling the end of the festivities. Returning to Sow's Horn held little appeal, and the thought of living in the quiet village beneath it was unappetizing. Reuniting with his grandfather would be nice, but sustaining 7 people in an inn would deplete his wealth rapidly. Reminded of his guards' loyalty, he decided to reward them with a bonus for their past actions and continued dedication, both during the bandit encounter before the tourney and their ongoing service for a salary of silver stags. The thought of the Ivy Inn and the charming Elenay crossed Christopher's mind, but he knew that without a clear goal, he might lose focus on restoring his house. Becoming a lord was imperative, the logical progression from knighthood. Christopher delved into books on how lowborns and bastards had risen in the past, but he wasn't a son of King Aegon IV and did unfortunately not possess a secret Targaryen prince as a squire. So it wasn't particularly useful in his case. "Sir Christopher, just the man I was looking for," a cultured voice interrupted his thoughts. Turning, he faced Prince Rhaegar, accompanied by Sir Arthur Dane, Lord John Connington, and the prince's 2 knighted squires, Sir Richard Lonmouth and Sir Miles Mouton. Christopher rose, his companions following suit. "My prince, how may I be of service?" Prince Rhaegar's pleasant smile didn't mask the calculated look in his indigo eyes, indicating this was no casual encounter. Though Christopher doubted anything the prince did was spontaneous, the Targaryen seemed very calculating in contrast to his unstable father. "Well, I realized we have failed to converse and intended to rectify this," the prince said, moving beside him. "You have impressed greatly, and I am not just talking about your melee victory. You are remarkably well spoken for someone not born to nobility or trained as a maester," Prince Rhaegar acknowledged with apparent genuine interest. Christopher blinked, still a bit sleepy. "I really have Adam to thank. He's the baseborn son of Sir Roger Hogg. Though not residing in the castle, he was fostered with my uncle and Robin's father. Adam received lessons from the castle's maester, and, in turn, taught me my letters and numbers." Christopher shot a grateful look at Adam, who responded with a slightly embarrassed eye roll. The library, with no offense intended, was quite underutilized. "My position as a castle guard afforded me more privileges than merely being Adam's foster brother during my free time," Christopher added, subtly criticizing the Marshal Sir Roger for neglecting the wealth of books and tomes. Rhaegar looked impressed at both Christopher and Adam. "A truly heartwarming story, and your diligence and your friend's loyalty seem to be long-standing," the prince remarked, pausing as he glanced speculatively at Robin and their guards. "I do wonder, though, if you have any plans after this tournament?" Christopher exchanged a glance with Adam before responding, "No, my prince, it is something we have been wondering as well." In truth, Christopher chuckled slightly, intrigued by the prince's comment. Was there an offer in the air? "If I may skip beating around the bush, I'm interested in hiring all of your party. I assume you are familiar with the City Watch of King's Landing? The Gold Cloaks, as they are called," Prince Rhaegar inquired. Christopher was taken aback. He hadn't expected the prince to show interest in the Gold Cloaks, the city's law enforcers. They were notably kept away from the Red Keep, where the personal Targaryen men-at-arms guarded. "We are familiar," Adam replied, breaking the silence that had settled, indicating Christopher's absorption in his thoughts. After Lord Tywin's resignation as Hand, Lord Owen Merryweather has been appointed in Lord Lannister's stead, the Targaryen prince explained. Christopher had heard of Lord Lannister's resignation, with the theft of his golden heir being the last straw. However, the news of a new Hand, Lord Owen Merryweather, was unknown to him. It seems the commander of the Gold Cloaks, one Sir Bertrand Crakehall, has followed suit, as I just received word of him leaving for Crakehall, Rhaegar informed them, appearing almost irritated. A creature of Lord Tywin, he has proven, but as Lord Lannister himself admittedly competent. Christopher was unfamiliar with both Lord Owen Merryweather and Sir Bertrand Crakehall, relying solely on the prince's judgment. Rhaegar paused as Robin made a motion with his hand. No disrespect meant, but what does this have to do with us? Robin's directness surprised Christopher. He wasn't very awake either if he dared to question the Crown Prince in such a manner. I am almost there, Sir Robin, the prince said with a patient smile, though a flicker of irritation hinted at his unfamiliarity with being questioned. Lord John Connington, in his red attire, took a step forward, hand on his sword hilt, wearing an incensed expression. No need, John. He meant no disrespect, and I understand how this may seem unimportant to some. The hidden insult wasn't lost on Christopher. While he found himself more irritated by Prince Rhaegar's subtle jabs compared to his father's overt insults, he decided against testing the Crown Prince's patience. This all leads to my reason for recruiting you fine folk. The new hand's appointment worries me. A young and inexperienced Sir Arnold Merryweather is now commander of the City Watch. While I may not be allowed to comment much on nepotism, I greatly doubt this young man's competence. He is here at Harrenhal, and so far, he has not convinced me otherwise. Prince Rhaegar said with a small smile and some humour. Christopher mirrored the prince's small smile, at least he was self-aware. Christopher had some inkling of Prince Rhaegar's motivations but did wonder when the prince would get to the point. My father would never allow me to appoint the commander or any captains of the City Watch. His Master of Whispers, Varys, would keep him well informed if I tried, Prince Rhaegar added, sending Christopher a significant look. I have, however, been able to arrange for 2 open positions as sergeants at the Gate of the Gods. The city's gates, like everything in this realm, have a hierarchy, but the Gate of the Gods is one of the most prominent, being the one closest to the start of the Gold Road. The pay is generous, in my humble opinion, and I assure you that promotion would not be far in the future if you continue to impress as you have here, even without my sway. Christopher finally had a question. Would not this Master of Whispers notice your influence? I thought he reported to your father and halted any such schemes, if I am allowed to call it that. Prince Rhaegar smiled with glinting eyes. Well, you see, none of the members of the court are without their own ambitions, not necessarily lining up with my father's or mine, though Lord Staunton does come close. Sir Arthur snorted at this comment. Christopher knew that Lord Staunton was the master of laws, though not very respected, given the prince's comment and Sir Arthur's reaction. Varys and I do share opinions on certain matters, but he would have to report me trying to appoint any commanders or captains, if only to stop the other small council members from running to the king themselves. My father has little patience for any treason, real or otherwise. The prince emphasized the last part, and Christopher, having observed King Aerys's obvious paranoia, needed no convincing that the king cared little for extensive evidence of treason, regardless of facts. Sergeants, however? And rapid promotions through the ranks? My father's other councillors are not that attentive to such details, so Varys would be free to let it slip his mind, Prince Rhaegar calmly explained. And up until commander, promotions within the Gold Cloaks are internal and decided by the commander himself or at specific gates, the captain. Again, with your competence, you may not even need me to influence things, ideally. I fear that the standards will start slipping quite rapidly with Sir Bertrand's departure. It would not surprise me to see the Lannisters and their men holding these sand castles together and then letting them collapse in their absence. Some young Reach knights certainly would not be able to stop that. Prince Rhaegar once more paused, his look significant. And I will need loyal and, most importantly, competent men to either hinder or fix this sometime in the future. Such a service would be rewarded greatly if you're successful, Prince Rhaegar finally stated, making it clear what he was alluding to. Christopher's answer seemed to have fallen right into his lap, though it would be foolish to accept it offhandedly. Christopher exchanged looks with Robin and Adam, even some of the guards, though they looked quite clueless before returning his attention to the prince. I believe we need to discuss this among ourselves and come back to you if we are allowed. Of course, it is a big decision, and while I would be greatly appreciative, I would not force you to do this in any way. You have until midday tomorrow at the latest, hopefully, sooner rather than later, though, Prince Rhaegar said with a final polite smile as he waved and departed with his entourage in tow. What do you think? Adam eventually broke the silence as they all returned to their seats around the pot. It was obviously directed at Christopher. Christopher was conflicted. The prospect of becoming a gold cloak seemed promising, given his familiarity from his time as a hob guard. The pay would undoubtedly be attractive, especially considering Prince Rhaegar's mention of it. However, the specifics of what the literal prince considered a good salary for a gold cloak remained unclear to Christopher. The prince didn't appear entirely disconnected from at least the gold cloaks, given the prince's observations of Sir Arnel Merryweather and predictions about the small council's actions. On the other side, it would be a decisive move, effectively hitching his cart to Prince Rhaegar's proverbial horse. The prince appeared highly competent and intelligent, displaying a studied and attentive approach to smaller details. The Targaryen madness had a basis in fact, likely rooted in their incestuous practices, though not as physically affected as other peoples. Christopher imagined that if he were to sire any children with a hypothetical sister, things would quickly get ugly, never mind the taboo, and certainly not to mention the potential consequences over several repeated generations. Christopher paused, an uncharacteristic moment of hesitation. I am inclined to accept the prince's offer. Aligning with him carries risks, especially considering the battle lines drawn between supporters of Prince Rhaegar and the king's men. Being burnt alive is not how I want to meet the gods. Christopher was careful not to specify which gods. His guards were followers of the Seven, even the Northmen, though originating from White Harbor. Christopher believed that Robin also followed the Seven, even if he wasn't a particularly pious man. Christopher and Adam, however, had a more pragmatic approach. He didn't believe in any gods, though felt drawn to the less regimented old gods of the North and his ancestors. The fact remained that the Seven dominated almost all lands south of the Neck, and it wouldn't do to alienate them or risk being burned as an apostle. Adam, on the other hand, could care less. The Seven called Adam a sinner for simply living, and he held no connection to the old gods, so he remained godless. I agree with your assessment, but what other choices do we have? I must admit that the prince's offer sounds a lot more appetizing than continuing to wander the idyllic Rivelander hills, Adam stated firmly. Their guards chuckled heartily. I, my lord, don't believe you have lived before you have seen the exotic knolls around the stony sept, one of them heckled, and Christopher snorted. I will take your word for it, Mern, Christopher replied. What about the muddy plains beneath Acorn Hill, sir? The shrubbery is to die for, I tell you, the dirty blonde Jeremy added, grinning. Very well, we shall not stay in the Riverlands, at least, Christopher finally conceded. I want your opinion, Robin, before I decide, though. Robin seemed a little surprised but then grinned slightly. Well, I have had enough herring to last a lifetime, they all chuckled before he shook his head. I do believe we should accept the prince's offer. This is not something we will stumble upon otherwise, and I think we will regret it if we don't. Christopher nodded resolutely, his family having spoken. Well said, though I don't believe we will ever be able to escape the herring, Robin. Do inform the prince or one of his followers of our decision, ideally before the joust so we are finished with it all at the feast tonight. Christopher paused for a moment in contemplation. I would not like to imagine Prince Rhaegar's reaction if we walk back on our word, so if we regret our decision, that's too bad unless we fancy our chances in the free cities. Council dismissed, he said pompously, and the others seemed to still be waiting. His companions finally walked away with chuckles. It would be interesting to see who would win the joust, he admitted. Prince Rhaegar had knocked Brandon Stark off his horse the previous day and was a definite favourite. Sir Arthur still stood undefeated, and Sir Barristan Selmy was legendary for his jousting, joining his charge and brother. Lord Jon Royce once again impressed, snagging the second-to-last place, with Sir Brynden Tully filling the last position. As the last 5 contenders, they would face each other in a sort of semi-finals, and the best and second best would meet in the finale. If there were multiple contenders at the second place, they would have one more tilt, assuming it was only 2 contenders that were tied, to decide. It promised to be an interesting competition. Eddard Stark was grateful that this was the final day of jousting. With his brother defeated, he couldn't muster enough care to cheer for anyone, though Lord Jon Royce was his favourite if he were forced to decide. Sir Christopher, as he was now called, sat on his right with one of his shadows missing, Sir Robin, if Ned wasn't mistaken. This meant Sir Adam sat on Christopher's right side again. Brandon and Benjen were seated with the Darling of the Vale, Sir Elbert Arryn, and a few other friends that Brandon, of course, had made during this brief week at Harrenhal. It was not surprising, as Ned's brother had always been the more gregarious one of the two, of all 3 Stark brothers, admittedly. Ned believed he had spied a Mallister, Dustin, Royce, and Glover man surrounding his 2 siblings a little way away in the stands. On his left meanwhile sat his sister, Lyanna. As the tourney drew closer to its end, Ned only felt more frustrated with his sister and her betrothed. His best friend, Robert, Ned could concede that his sister had not received the best first impression with her future husband. It had happened almost immediately after the Northerners and his party from the Vale had met at the junction of the High Road and King's Road. Gods, that felt long ago, even if it was only a moon ago. A damned runner had been sent from Lord Jon himself to inform Robert in person. It had obviously been meant to reach them before the King's Road, but they were not that lucky, quite the opposite being possibly the worst timing. Needless to say, Lyanna was not amused, and Robert celebrating briefly didn't help. His friend could, at times, act before his brain could catch up, unfortunately for the Stormlord. Robert, in Ned's eyes, was the perfect husband in some ways. He could have befriended a feral wildling with his gregarious nature and without a sliver of shyness. He did of course have his faults as well, but was that not human? No one is perfect. Ned knew he was biased to some degree, but for the loyalty he held for his friend, he could not believe him a bad person, flawed undoubtedly but not a bad man. He thought Lyanna was beginning to drag it out of spite now, seemingly focusing on every minute detail she did not like about Robert. Ned's friend always broke fast with the Starks, and only Brandon's social skills kept it from being an awkward mess most of the time. It would not surprise him if Lyanna were doing it, as she could be quite childish from what he remembered before his fostering at the Eyrie. Lyanna was still as willful as ever, even having received a large bruise on her stomach of all places. When he had noticed and asked about it, she had mentioned slipping and falling on the edge of a table. It seemed quite far-fetched and sounded like a lie to his ears, but he didn't imagine bluntly announcing this to her would yield any results. Besides, it was thankfully completely hidden under her long flowing blue dress that she had decided to wear today. Eddard couldn't claim to know much about women's fashion, never mind his sister's wardrobe, but it was a noticeable shift from her woolen dresses that she had worn at the start of the tourney. He wasn't even aware she possessed such a dress, to be honest, but now he was questioning what he knew about her after suspecting her of lying, so there was that. Like, had she ever worn her hair in a braid before? He could not recall. His jumbled thoughts were soon pushed to the back of his mind as the finalists rode out to cheers in front of the crowd. He absent-mindedly noticed Sir Robin arriving, whispering something in Christopher's ear before taking his seat. Christopher, in turn, seemed pleased but didn't reply, as his eyes were still focused upon the jousters who were now lined up neatly. Eddard let his eyes drift down to the contestants and was immediately drawn to Prince Rhaegar's knight black plate armor, with the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen decorated in rubies on its breastplate. The prince's distinctive black helmet had gold, red, and orange streamers resembling flames, though it was presently hung on the Targaryen's majestic mount, displaying Prince Rhaegar's handsome face to them all, a maiden's dream from a song of some kind, Eddard imagined. And the perfect man in many ways too, Ned could not name any faults, at the very least. The prince curiously let his gaze pause in their direction for a few moments. Ned could not distinguish Prince Rhaegar's exact focus nor a reason for the man to focus so heavily on them. The silver-haired prince soon let his gaze slip from them, and Ned, in turn, let the peculiar moment move to the back of his mind. Strange. Any predictions or favorites, Lord Eddard? Christopher asked casually as the final contenders were announced and the finals explained by a herald. It was unfortunate that Lord Brandon was defeated, but I would claim that it wasn't an unexpected result either. Prince Rhaegar's lance never seems to miss. Eddard shot his sister an irritated look as she bumped into him before answering. I do agree. I imagine Brandon would admittedly have needed quite the lucky run to end up in the final, never mind becoming the victor. So with him eliminated, I would hedge my bets on Sir Barristan Selmy and support Lord Jon. Fine jousters both, I will, however, have to say that Prince Rhaegar is my favourite. He has won in the lists against all but the Blackfish and Lord Jon, though they have never met either, Christopher analysed. Anything can happen, was Ned's reply, though he did agree that Christopher's assessment was probably quite reasonable. They would have to see, though. The first jousters, Sir Arthur Dane against Sir Brynden Tully, lined up, and the flag soon dropped. The first tilt was indecisive as both lances glanced across the opposite's shield. The clash of wood and metal resonated through the air before cheers replaced it. As the tension mounted, two more tilts followed in rapid succession. Ned keenly observed the subtle shifts in the jouster's stance and the controlled power in the horse's movements. Yet, with each pass, it became evident that Sir Brynden was the less steady of the two, struggling to maintain his balance. His assessment proved correct as, in the final pass, Sir Arthur's lance found its mark with precision. The impact was audible, and Sir Brynden, valiant in his efforts, was unseated from his saddle. Despite the fall, the Tully Knight executed a skilled roll, preventing any serious injuries. The crowd erupted in applause, acknowledging both the victor and the defeated knight in this display of skill and chivalry. A fine joust, indeed. Ned would not argue against that jousting had its moments because that would be a bold-faced lie. He was however resolute that it probably wouldn't gain anything more than a glancing interest from him. As the jousting continued, the next two matchups unfolded swiftly, Sir Barristan versus Lord Jon Royce and Sir Brynden Tully versus Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The clashes seemed to fly past in a blur of precision and skill. In a decisive display, Sir Barristan triumphed over Lord Jon Royce in just two tilts. The swift and calculated movements of both knights showcased their mastery, but ultimately it was Sir Barristan who emerged victorious. Similarly, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen exhibited his prowess in a brief but impactful joust against Sir Brynden Tully. In a single tilt, the silver-haired prince left the crowd in awe of his exceptional horsemanship and lance control. The onlookers murmured with anticipation as Sir Arthur Dane lined up against Prince Rhaegar after a small break. "Think he's tired?" Christopher inquired once more. The Stark shook his head with firm conviction. "After just one joust? No, none are in better condition entering this round." Sir Arthur had a longer break but secured victory in his fifth tilt, and Prince Rhaegar just finished a single joust with a comfortable water break in between. "One of the finalists may well be determined right here though," Ned added, and Christopher chuckled lightly. "You Northmen don't beat around the bush, do you?" Christopher remarked in amusement. Ned nodded resolutely, taking pride in his straightforwardness. "Aye, winter waits for no one, and needless conversation won't make it any warmer," Ned answered calmly as Sir Arthur and Prince Rhaegar thundered toward each other. A great crash echoed through the air, and splinters from the broken lances scattered. A moment of tense silence hung in the air as both jousters leaned heavily on their horses, only to be replaced by cheers from the crowd as they swiftly regained their composure, accepting new lances. "How are the winters at the Eyrie then?" Christopher inquired with curiosity as they observed another clash of the jousters, both struggling to land a clean strike. "Unfortunately, I would not call it mild. It varies, as far as I have gathered. During the winter season, the errands of the Eyrie have to move down to the Gates of the Moon, a castle at the foot of the Giant's Lance," Ned informed the knight factually before smiling. Though, of course, it is nothing compared to the north, half in jest. Of course, Christopher parroted dryly, with obvious amusement. Ned was reminded of his sister's presence as she gasped and leaned into him. He followed her gaze and saw Prince Rhaegar bent back on the horse once again. The fact that she had been so quiet was unusual in and of itself, but such a feminine gasp, he guessed it was nice for Robert to know that Lyanna wasn't missing a feminine side, even if her horse-riding skills and rebelliousness were quite prominent. Why his sister was so shocked by the jousting, he did not know, however. Prince Rhaegar managed to right himself up once again, and the jousters lined up for their fifth tilt of the round. The horses soon charged forward, and there was still some dust in the air from their previous tilts, so Ned didn't see the impact of the lance clearly. What he did witness was Sir Arthur being launched from his saddle and giving Prince Rhaegar his second victory. Sir Arthur seemed a little shaken from Ned's position as he rose to his feet but didn't appear to have sustained any serious injuries either. Could have ended quite ugly, that fall, Christopher remarked casually, and Ned simply nodded. As the Blackfish and Jon Royce prepared for their round, Ned rose to his feet. He would return for the finale, but he wasn't interested in sitting for the entire time. There most certainly were some merchants gathered, maybe he would peruse some wares to pass the time, he thought. Christopher glanced at him briefly but offered no other reaction. Tytos would have to admit that, while it was a nice display of jousting, it had not been too extraordinary. The match-up between Prince Rhaegar and Sir Arthur had proven interesting, as friends jousted against each other, but many of the other rounds lacked that special flair. They had now reached the finale, however, and it came as no surprise to Tytos that Prince Rhaegar and Sir Barristan ended up as finalists. His brother Jamis had placed a bet on one of them, though he wouldn't reveal which. His other brother, Edwin, and sister, Alysanne, remained much more reserved, observing with neutral expressions. Tytos was aware that both of them did not have much interest beyond books, as the extensive library at Raventree Hall was one of their most frequent destinations. The final jousters lined their mounts on each side of the fence, with lances raised in the air and visors open. The two had yet to meet, having both firmly secured first place in the semi-finals with 3 wins each. For the sake of excitement, it was decided to forsake their semi-final and move directly onto the final. The two nodded respectfully to each other before lowering both visor and lance. A young boy held the flag and scurried back as soon as he let it drop, and the horses began to thunder toward each other. Time seemed to slow as Tytos watched the two jousters maneuver their lances moments before impact. Unfortunately, Sir Barristan's dipped at the last second, hitting and breaking against the prince's shield and side. The prince managed a much better strike, hitting the older knight directly in the chest, an almost perfect strike, one could say. Sir Barristan managed to endure the strike, and they continued to their second tilt. It was an uncharacteristic mistake for the famed Kingsguard knight to drop his lance at such an unfortunate moment. In their second clash, they both struck each other firmly, though Rhaegar once again emerged as the superior in the encounter, looking a lot more steady than his old mentor and protector. If Sir Barristan's intention was to wear down his opponent, then Tytos feared that the prince would not be the first to fall in a war of attrition. The third, fourth, and fifth tilts were all indecisive, as none were felled, and neither competitor managed a solid strike. That after 5 tilts, Sir Barristan had yet to deliver even one well-placed blow seemed very strange to Tytos. As he reviewed the previous encounters, he reluctantly arrived at an unfortunate conclusion. Was the knight purposely conceding victory to Prince Rhaegar? He didn't like to entertain the thought that the chivalrous and almost legendary knight would do such a thing, but it seemed like the only logical assumption left. Tytos could sense something different in the air as the jousters lined up for their 6th tilt. There was an excited buzz from the small folk in the stands as they whispered about how many tilts it would take to bring down either competitor. Many more experienced jousters in the stands seemed as confused as he felt, and he assumed they had explored the same assumptions as he had. The two jousters charged toward each other. The distance rapidly shrank, and a split second before clashing, Prince Rhaegar leaned forward in his saddle, and his lance broke perfectly upon the now battered breastplate of the Kingsguard knight. Titos frowned as Sir Barristan was finally unseated, with not one successful strike to show for it. The fact that the knight's shield hadn't even managed to block the prince's final strike seemed sloppy. It either spoke of a great diminishment of skills for the famed knight or hinted at a planned affair. The cheers from the crowd drowned out any discontent from the more observant nobles. Titos clapped as Prince Rhaegar rode past in a victory lap. The prince had performed admirably in this tourney, and as Titos observed the unkempt form of the king, he wondered privately how long it would be before the prince was no longer Prince of Dragonstone. Titos didn't anticipate a second dance or anything so drastic, but a quiet coup in the Red Keep and a great council soon after would not surprise him. The unstable mental fortitude of the king only became more apparent to every lord in the realm for each day that passed. He was about to depart, uninterested in any closing ceremony for such a disappointing joust, before stopping himself as a hush descended, and Edwin tapped him on the side. He followed his brother's shocked gaze and was initially confused about what was so startling. Prince Rhaegar held the crown for the Queen of Love and Beauty, hanging it on the tip of his lance. What Titos quickly realized, with a small sense of dread, was that the man's wife, Princess Elia, was already behind him as onlookers desperately tried to understand where the Dragon Prince was going. The mount slowed in front of a grey banner adorned with a direwolf, an unmistakable sigil that could not be further from the yellow and orange colours of House Martell. This was most certainly a mistake, but not in Prince Rhaegar's mind as he extended his lance toward the sitting and admittedly comely figure of Lady Lyanna Stark, Rhaegar's cousin's betrothed, as if it couldn't get more problematic. The crown of winter roses landed in the girl's lap, and Titos winced at her smitten smile. By the gods! The prince then departed with a nod and soon disappeared into one of the tunnels. Titos looked to the girl's brother, the second son Eddard. The ward of Lord Arryn seemed completely horrified. After all, he was the foster brother of Lord Robert Baratheon, Titos reminded himself. Titos let his gaze move briefly to the form of Christopher on the opposite side of Eddard again. Titos' acquaintance wore a completely calm expression on his handsome face, but Titos swore he could see great annoyance in the man's distinctive eyes even from this distance. What was that about? Titos soon left with his family in tow. He could not bear to stay there for a moment longer. However, from a distance, he did witness Robert Baratheon's blazing red face. Ours is the fury indeed. Titos and his family opted to skip the feast scheduled for that evening, choosing to turn in early in their tents. The next morning, Titos woke early and was soon joined by Edwin. The two exchanged greetings before directing their servants to start disassembling and packing their tents and belongings. After breaking his fast briefly, Titos woke Alisan and Jamis. By midday, the sun had shifted, and everywhere around him, servants went back and forth, loading endless carts and carriages. Horses were taken from stables and watered. They were soon ready for his family's departure, though they would wait for their vassals Bigglestone, Shawnee, and Page. Titos simply sat by his trusted chestnut-coloured palfrey when he saw Sir Christopher Mudd appear. "Sir Christopher," he called, and the young man changed his course for the Blackwood air. "Sir Titos," the Mudd greeted once close enough. "Well, I did say that I would forego my title as long as you lacked one, but I hope we still can be more casual in private," Titos requested, and Christopher nodded with a small smile. "Of course, Titos, I will never forget your friendliness even to a completely unknown man such as I was a short week ago. I thank you for the kind words, but do not sell yourself short," Titos said, smiling. "You are no ordinary man, surname and knighthood besides, do not forget that." He did not know where the words came from, but he felt a fondness for the impressive knight even with their brief knowledge of one another. "And where will you end up next then?" "Raventree Hall would be open to you and yours, I assure you, for a time at least," Titos offered with a curious look. He was a little surprised when Christopher gained a hard expression. "I thank you for the generous offer, but I am afraid I may not be able to take you up on it for quite some time," the young knight replied curtly. The prince already extended an offer for a position in the gold cloaks yesterday before noon, something I accepted. My cousin barely managed to tell him of our acceptance before the joust. That explained things. And it was very unfortunate for the ambitious Mud Knight. There had been, for many years, nothing to criticize the Crown Prince on. A good amount of that goodwill had dried up from his stunt yesterday. The moment the smiles died, some called it, and Titos could not help but consider it an apt name. I wish you luck in your future endeavors, Christopher, and hope that even in this turbulent time, you may continue to achieve great things, Titos eventually said, and he could see that Christopher was genuinely grateful for the Blackwood's words. Everyone had been so focused on the rift between the king and the heir that the increasing disillusionment of the lords and the crown had almost been ignored. This was on full display as the Errands, along with the two wards of Lord John, Eddard Stark, and Robert Baratheon, had left for the Eyrie the previous evening without even informing the host, Lord Went, and more importantly, the crown. Titos had heard rumors that the king had been enraged at the disrespect. I must depart now, Titos. May our next meeting be better, Christopher said with a respectful tone. I hope so as well, Christopher, Titos replied before the knight nodded and then turned on his heel and left. Titos couldn't help but gaze at the dragon banners of House Targaryen. While an intimidating banner, it had been many years since it had been enforced with a live representation. Without those beasts, House Targaryen seemed a lot less formidable, even if it had taken many decades for some to realize. They sure as hell made the same mistakes as the common man, the golden cloaks. The waves of nostalgia washed over Christopher as he traversed the familiar dirt path with his retinue. Sow's Horn, with its stout keep, and the village below, evoked memories that felt both incredibly close and yet distant, like echoes from another time. Even a moon later, Christopher couldn't shake off the annoyance stemming from the prince's thoughtless stunt. Placing his trust in a Targaryen was a gamble, and on the very same day, the prince's impulsive actions tested that trust. What were the odds? He almost thought a deity of some kind was having him on. Nevertheless, amidst his irritation, Christopher found gratitude for the prince's gesture of goodwill at the departure from Harrenhal, the generous gift of sturdy palfreys for his entire party. They had not interacted much, as the prince was almost constantly surrounded by his small retinue of friends at the front of the travelling party. Christopher was granted leave to split off from the prince to visit Sow's Horn before meeting at King's Landing. These well-bred mounts, though not intended for the rigours of war or the splendours of the joust, served their purpose admirably. Christopher had no immediate need for such martial pursuits, and the palfreys were excellent companions for long journeys. He appreciated the thoughtful choice, allowing him to hone his horsemanship skills in preparation for a more war-worthy mount in the hopefully distant future. He would feel a lot more comfortable in a war with lands sworn to him and more than 5 men under his command. He could however not complain about the loyalty of his companions, which was unwavering and absolute. His guards, now decked out in chainmail and mud-coloured tabards, looked every bit the part of a lord's retinue. The chests strapped to their mounts, carrying Christopher's combined fortunes, were a testament to the trust he placed in them. Feeling secure in this trust, Christopher couldn't help but appreciate the reciprocated relationship he shared with his guards. They saw him as the one who gave their lives purpose, and though he might not be as close to them as he was to Adam and Robin, there was an understanding built on respect and trust. It was a pleasant feeling, making him wonder how some lords could overlook the privilege of such loyalty. They had spent the night at Lord Butterwell's Butter Hall before parting ways with the prince early in the morning. It had taken most of the day since leaving the King's Road to reach Sow's Horn. The sun, though not completely gone, hung low in the sky as they rode calmly into the village. Even though the village appeared to be gearing up for the night, their arrival did not go unnoticed as they passed by. Initially unrecognized by many, the few who did gasped dramatically and quickly informed those nearby. Riding through the central market square, they noticed that the merchants had just closed their stalls for the evening. Christopher, leading the way, directed the course away from the keep along a familiar dirt road that he had traversed hundreds of times before. While on foot, It had always felt quite lengthy, but on horseback, the journey passed quickly. "Hasn't changed a bit," Adam commented with a hint of fondness as the small house came into view. Christopher couldn't help but agree. After all, it had only been a year, so the lack of change wasn't surprising. They dismounted, and while Adam, Robin, and Christopher planned to stay in their childhood home, the guards insisted on lodging at the town's Soul Inn, the Hog, a tavern that held many of Christopher's fondest memories. With a wave, the guards took the reins of their mounts and headed off towards the inn. The three friends stood there for a few moments. Christopher closed his eyes, almost able to pick up on familiar scents, though he acknowledged it might just be his imagination. The steady spinning of the water wheel by the stream and mill behind his uncle's house reached his ears. The hours spent hauling bags of flour or repairing that stubborn wheel were still vivid in Christopher's mind. "We should go in," Robin eventually stated. His cousin had most certainly changed from the excited but immature boy he had been before their departure. Christopher couldn't help but wonder how his uncle would react to his son's change. "Indeed, wouldn't want to catch a cold," Christopher said before walking toward the house. It was after all still winter and had been for the last few years. Christopher remembered Lord Beesbury mentioning that the Maesters had wrongly assumed it was finally spring by how mild the weather had been, but had been proven wrong. Some even had begun to call it the year of the full spring. Though considering they were only in the 6th moon of the year, Christopher considered this may be a little too early to say. He didn't know much about the seasons either, not more than the Maesters at the very least. Christopher reached the sturdy door first and knocked firmly on the wood. Although he couldn't hear anything from within the house, he could see the flicker of flames through the windows. A minute passed, and Christopher began to contemplate whether to knock again when suddenly the door swung inward, revealing a completely unknown woman, quite young, though a few days older than Christopher. The woman glanced at their three armored forms and quickly courtesied, likely assuming they were nobles. "My husband is in the mill behind, I'm sure you noticed it, sirs." The woman was about to close the door and Christopher put his armored foot against it, halting the action. A wave of concern washed over him. Had someone else taken over the house? He suddenly feared that his uncle had passed or something equally distressing. "Husband? Does Roger not live here anymore?" Christopher asked in bemusement. Surely, his uncle hadn't moved. That man didn't have an exploring bone in his body and certainly wouldn't relocate from the homestead that his father and forefathers had inhabited for years. The woman's eyebrows knitted in confusion. "Of course Roger still lives here, he is my husband, sirs," she replied firmly, though still displaying a sense of perplexity. This was most certainly not his aunt, which could only mean one thing. It was horrible what happened to his first wife. One day her heart simply stopped. Could have been worse, I suppose, but she still had so much life in her, and then suddenly, dead. The three young men were stunned into silence, and the woman, Christopher's new aunt apparently, continued. "And her son ran off with Roger's nephew. A boy my husband had raised since birth dragged his son off on some foolish adventure or something. His grandfather is still here, old Tristan, though I fear the stranger is not far away from that man." Christopher felt a mix of relief and sadness at the mention of his grandfather. It was reassuring to know he still lived, but the suggestion that the end might be near was disheartening. "Enough, woman. I am Robin, son of Roger, and I will hear no more of this," Robin exclaimed with obvious anger. Her eyes widened in surprise and fear at the outburst, though there was something in her dark eyes that Christopher couldn't quite decipher. "You are Robin?" Her disbelief was evident as her eyes scrutinized Christopher's cousin. Christopher began to wonder if it was Robin's presence or appearance. His cousin had filled out nicely, no longer as lanky as he once was. It would have amused Christopher greatly if not for the troubling circumstances. "I think we will need to get Roger and clear up some things," Adam mediated reasonably, sensing that things could escalate quickly. Christopher nodded in agreement. "May we enter?" Christopher realized that she had never revealed her name. She reddened in embarrassment. "Barra, eh?" "We are all knights," Adam eventually said, noticing her uncertainty about what to call them. Oh, oh. Her eyes shifted back to Robin in shock. This could be interesting. It was bad enough that she was Christopher's aunt, but now she seemed quite taken with Robin after just a glance. How would this end then? Robin, thankfully, seemed oblivious to this. I will go get Roger, Adam informed them before walking off around the corner. Christopher turned his eyes to Barra, raising an eyebrow. She eventually remembered what he had asked and quickly took a step back. Christopher walked in, and Robin trailed behind him with a distant look on his face. His cousin still didn't reveal much on his face, but Christopher could see the sadness in his brown eyes. Robin was strong, but Adam and Christopher would make sure to be there for him. Your mother loved you very much. I still remember her when we departed. It was obvious then, and it is still now, Christopher said quietly to his cousin. Robin sent a weak smile back, but Christopher could see it was forced. They made it into a common room of sorts with a fireplace and some benches, where they soon settled down. There was complete silence as Christopher and Robin sat on one bench, and Barra sat on the other. They soon heard shuffling from the entrance, and all their eyes settled on the stern visage of Christopher's uncle as he and Adam entered. Roger was almost casual as he strolled over to a pot that hung over the fireplace. Christopher, you have returned, he greeted gruffly with his back turned to them. Christopher's rage at the man's petty display welled up in his stomach, and he shot up to his feet. How dare his uncle do this to his own son? To not even acknowledge his presence after a year? 2. Roger's eyes widened when he turned and saw Christopher approaching. Christopher ensured his punch would not propel his uncle into the fireplace, but he had no other considerations as his fist connected with his uncle's right cheek. Immediate pain emanated from his hand, but the satisfying view of his uncle collapsing to the floor dulled the pain. His ears rang, almost only hearing his heartbeat hammering in his ears. However, he did register Barra's scream from beside him as she rushed to the side of his uncle. His uncle was obviously dazed but not unconscious as he rolled on the floor in pain. Soon, Roger seemed to regain his senses and even pushed Barra a little away before standing. He had blood on the right side of his face from a split lip and a flaming red cheek that would bruise quite seriously. Christopher's uncle seemed ready to return the favor, but Adam swiftly moved to Christopher's side with a hand on his sword handle, a clear warning in his eyes. Roger visibly held himself back before stumbling backward and eventually ending up on a chair. The man sighed in absolute defeat, and as Christopher's rage dissipated ever so slowly, he felt sadness at his uncle's weary form. This man had raised him for the majority of his childhood, so why did he have to be such a horrible father? He had managed to be a good uncle but had never seemed happy with Robin, always criticizing his son, or, to Christopher's shame, comparing his cousin to him. Christopher had always been pushed by his grandfather and had never regretted his unending work ethic and will to perform as well as he could, until now when he realized how this had affected his cousin Robin's relationship with his own father. Why? Robin's emotionless voice suddenly came from behind Christopher. Having stood, when Christopher's uncle failed to even react, Robin walked past them. Why do you despise me so? I have received a knighthood now by the king himself. Roger finally looked up at Robin, though he maintained a carefully blank expression. And yet, you still consider me a failure because I did not stay, Robin concluded. Roger stayed silent for a moment. You seem to have already achieved much, but you are my son no longer. You are Sir Robin now, or something like that, Roger said tiredly. I am sure you have much ahead of you in your life, but as long as you don't inherit and settle down here in our forefathers' legacy, then you are no son of mine. I was not meant for anywhere outside of Sow's Horn, and you were obviously meant for everywhere but. It never came as a surprise to either me or your mother when you left with your cousin, Christopher's uncle finished, still holding his son's gaze. Robin stayed still for quite some time before nodding ultimately. Very well, my triumphs will be my own as well as my failures, then, he said before marching out of the room. Adam and Christopher exchanged confused glances before Adam eventually followed Robin. Tristan is in his room, was Roger's final remark as Christopher walked past toward the bedrooms. He did not answer his uncle as he heard Barra once again fuss over her husband. Christopher took a breath as he arrived at his grandfather's door before carefully opening it. It was quite dark, with only weak sunlight streaming through a small window. Christopher could feel a gentle breeze from the opening before he closed the door behind him. The walls were Spartan, except for a brown banner hung above the bed decorated with an emerald-encrusted golden crown. Christopher felt pride and a small sense of accomplishment as he realized that he finally had put the sigil back into use, even if it was only as his knightly coat of arms. His grandfather's frail form was sitting at a desk with an open book in front of him, one of the last that Christopher had borrowed from the keep's library if he wasn't mistaken. Though his grandfather wasn't reading it, simply keeping a hand on the frail pages, as far as Christopher could see. "Grandfather," he announced himself. There was an immediate reaction even in his grandfather's old vessel as he turned around with a great smile. Christopher had a bittersweet feeling in his chest as he saw the man's unfocused eyes that obviously did not see much as they shifted from side to side. "Christopher? You have returned." His grandfather's excited voice was startling, but Christopher shook his head fondly as well. He struggled to imagine his grandfather as completely infirm, as the old man even in this state still held a strength to him. "How was the tournament? Has House Mud been refreshed in certain lords' minds?" Tristan asked with a proud tone. "I would say some have at least become aware of us again, as I became the champion of the melee and received a knighthood soon after for services to the king," Christopher replied with pride, having accomplished much for their house, even if the last day of the tourney had soured it. The tears were obvious in Tristan's eyes as Christopher hunched beside him and held a wrinkly hand. His grandfather squeezed his hand with surprising strength. With a slightly choked voice, his grandfather replied, "You are truly everything I could have asked for, prayed for. The gods of our ancestors surely blessed me with your birth." Christopher could feel himself grow emotional at his grandfather's kind words. His mentor and his idol in many ways. "A knighthood, Sir Christopher, does sound simply natural, my grandson. But I refuse to believe that you will stay here. Where will you go next?" his grandfather asked. "Adam and I have gotten positions as sergeants in the Gold Cloaks by Prince Rhaegar himself," Christopher replied, though he did not bother to delve into his faltering trust in Prince Rhaegar. His grandfather nodded but also adopted a serious expression. "A good friend to have, but aligning yourself with him may bring you into a position that you do not control but still feel the consequences of. The prince may not fear much else than his father, but you and our house do not have the same luxury," his grandfather warned him wisely. He grew a little less serious as well, though. "And when will the next generation of House Mud arrive, then?" his grandfather inquired lightly. Christopher paused for a moment. "It may be greedy, but I have my sights set on Lord Went's daughter, Lady Sarah, grandfather." "Oh? And would Lord Went grant you this?" Christopher shook his head before realizing the folly. "Not yet. Firstly, he is most certainly not the true power of Harrenhal. His wife, Lady Shella, would have to take that honor. I did manage a dance with Lady Sarah, though, and she seems quite smitten with me." "Good, it would be a valuable union for us, though it is unfortunate you will need something for Lady Shella to see the value of it. An exchange of vows with this girl without her parents' support would only cause problems, though I am pleased to hear that she is interested in you, which will be important for you, I am sure. A wife is meant as a partner in addition to being the mother of your children, never forget that." "I won't, grandfather," Christopher replied. "I would haunt you from the other side if you didn't," his grandfather jested before coughing strongly. Christopher swiftly helped him into bed and dragged the covers over his grandfather's small body. "Thank you, Christopher," his grandfather said weakly. "For everything," he emphasized soon after. Christopher was about to argue, but he knew that it would simply be a waste of breath. "And you, for everything," Christopher said in turn. His grandfather nodded weakly before falling asleep. Christopher could still see his grandfather's chest move weakly, so he knew he had not passed yet. He stayed for a moment more, observing the man who had started it all before departing. He met no one as he walked across the creaking wooden floor and arrived at the door leading out. A door he realized he would be using for the last time. He opened it and was greeted with the waiting forms of Adam and Robin, his only family soon enough. They had only stayed for the night at the inn before leaving at the break of dawn the next morning. They rode swiftly toward Hayford, where they would rejoin the King's Road. This journey took 2 days even at their speed. After reaching Hayford and the King's Road, they only used 1 more day to reach King's Landing. The capital of the 7 kingdoms, the king's seat of power, as Dragonstone belonged to the prince. Christopher could smell the city for some time before seeing it. The smell was infamous, of course, but he was still not prepared for it. Would this be his home? Hopefully, he could grow to disregard it as he almost held his coif in front of his face to shield his nose and mouth. It was visually impressive, at the very least, as the houses seemed to stretch on for leagues. The overlooking Red Keep in the distance was equally impressive, along with the immense marble dome of the Great Sept of Baelor, with 7 crystal towers reaching into the sky, visible from its position on Visenya's hill. They rode across a well-trodden path leading to the old gate closest to them from the northern King's Road. They slowed to a halt as the shadow of the portcullis enveloped them. As soon as Christopher announced his name to the golden-cloaked men guarding the gate, he was informed that Prince Rhaegar had requested that he and Adam immediately report to the western barracks located by Cobbler's Square. After receiving some directions on how to reach Cobbler's Square, and being told that it would be impossible to miss once there, they were off. As they initially maneuvered single file in narrow streets in the shadow of the Hill of Rhaenys, he observed the crooked 2-story buildings, all but leaning over the street they rode on. They received many looks from the small folk they rode past, but there was no further reaction, and the small folk soon returned to their own tasks. He was almost convinced that they were in the infamous Flea Bottom already before he got the pleasure of witnessing the sorry-looking buildings of the actual Flea Bottom. These were infinitely dirtier and more downtrodden, and while he couldn't see much as the alleys leading into it quickly twisted out of sight, he could still smell the even fouler stench as they only rode past on the Street of Flower before joining the Street of the Sisters. This street was one of the most central streets that connected Visenya's and Rhaenys Hills directly, as the name would imply. It was a lot wider than anything yet, though with more traffic as well, both carts and walking smallfolk. They were slowed down at times by merchants' carts before they moved to a side, letting them pass with some nervousness, obviously believing them to be nobles. This led to the centralmost square of King's Landing, where Christopher could see streets leading to Aegon's High Hill and the Red Keep, the harbour, or Baelor's Sept that stood close by. Christopher finally saw the statue of Baelor the Blessed that stood in front of the Great September. His party didn't stay for long, however, and continued to the right on the smallest street which soon led them to Cobbler's Square. The barracks were indeed hard to miss, being a large square and stout building with a courtyard in the middle. The small groups of golden-cloaked men made it even more obvious. Adam and Christopher then parted ways with Robin and the guards before riding toward the opening of the courtyard. Some gold cloaks looked at them curiously but did not try to stop them as they trotted through the small gate and into the courtyard. Christopher looked around a little bemused as he wondered who to report to before spotting a man waving them over. He and Adam dismounted their horses to lead them by foot in the small courtyard. As they neared the man, Christopher could easily spot that this man wore a black breastplate decorated with 2 gold discs, still with a woolen gold-dyed cloak fastened to his shoulders. In comparison to the other gold cloaks who had mail armor, it was obvious that this man was an officer of some kind. "Sirs Christopher Mudd and Adam Waters?" the man soon inquired, and they nodded in affirmation. "Welcome, as knights, you have both become officers, and it just so happens that 2 sergeants were recently promoted, though I would consider their new stations at the Mud Gate to be more of a punishment. Annoying fuckers, the both of them. Hopefully, you 2 are better," the man said bluntly. "Oi, you 2, stable these horses," the officer suddenly ordered 2 gold cloaks that were walking past. The 2 exchanged looks for a moment, but as the officer breathed angrily, they swiftly changed course and took the reins of the mounts from Adam and Christopher's hands. The officer bid them to follow as he walked to the entrance of the barracks. Gold Cloak stepped to the side for them as the three passed. Since Commander Red Tusk left, it seems like the watchmen have only grown more insolent. I believe an orphan from the deepest puddle of piss in Flea Bottom could do a better job than the new Commander Merriweather, the officer said with obvious disdain. As in Sir Bertrand Craighall? Christopher asked, not familiar with Red Tusk. The officer nodded. I was called Red Tusk here in the watch 'cause of the Craighall sigil. He didn't let them reply. The name's Lucas Stone. I am the lieutenant of Captain Ronald Penrose at the Gate of the Gods. It is why I have 2 discs on my uniform while you 2 will start with a singular. The captains of the gates have 4 discs, Lucas explained. He was not friendly but seemingly indifferent to them. Christopher did at least not hear any disdain like what he had talked about with the commander. When will we go on patrol, sir? Adam suddenly asked as they walked through the barren halls of the barracks. Lucas turned slightly and slowed. It is good to say, sir, as most officers here are knighted, but I am not one of them. You may call me lieutenant. To answer your question, I don't know exactly, but within at least 2 days. You will each receive command of a squad of 9 guardsmen and either be positioned at a gate, the walls close by, or to patrol the streets. It varies. Only 2 days of training? Christopher asked in surprise. Lucas sent him an exasperated look and nodded. Indeed, but times are hard, and standards have grown lax. You will probably be propositioned by watchmen for better postings in exchange for coins. Accept at your own risk. Christopher heard the warning but also understood the message written between the lines, that it was common as well. It seemed corruption had already taken root. They arrived at 2 doors, both decorated with signs stating mess hall, though one of the signs had golden painted writing. Lucas Stone nodded toward the golden sign. This is where the officers take their meals while the common watchmen eat in the other one. The lieutenant then grabbed 2 rings clinking with keys and presented them to them. As they took them, he continued. There will be 2 armories at the end of this hall similarly designated. These keys will grant you access to that and the officers' quarters. There has been prepared armor and arms in the armory for you both. I am sure we will see each other around. And with that, he left, soon disappearing around a corner of the hallway. The 2 turned to face each other. It seems to be in an even worse state than Prince Rhaegar feared, Adam began. Christopher nodded but saw the positives as well. It will only let us climb these ranks faster. One day, one of us may very well be a captain, and then we can really influence things. Hopefully, we either have grown fond of the job, or Rhaegar is ready to reward our efforts. This would be the best opportunity for Christopher to gain influence, and he did recognize this. While many nobles may disregard gold cloaks as simple guardsmen, Christopher wondered if it wouldn't be possible to cultivate an army guarding and, more importantly, controlling the whole of King's Landing. He had been mistaken with the city watch's reach even in the Red Keep. The gold cloaks even had a barracks up there where the commander was housed. And the one who controlled the king controlled the realm, in theory at least. Robin strolled through the uneven cobblestone street. He and the guards had been situated in an inn on Cobbler's Square, some houses away from the West Barracks where Christopher and Adam now were stationed. Their return to Sow's Horn still lingered in his mind, but he also appreciated how easily his father had made the decision to forge his own path. There were no what-ifs, as his father had made abundantly clear that there was no place for him in Sow's Horn, and had even started on a new family. He shook his head. Now it was time to lead his own life and support his true family. The 3 had met since their arrival at King's Landing, and Robin had sought Adam and Christopher's opinion on what he was supposed to do. At the very same time, he had an idea whirring around his head which he had shared, and Christopher agreed with. And that led him here to the Street of Silk and this establishment. He had asked around the inn before leaving and had learned that this brothel, the Red Ruby, was frequented quite regularly by many lords living in the Red Keep, so it was here he would start his scheme. There was a small wooden sign decorated with a large red jewel, assuring him that he had arrived at the correct place. A bell rang as he opened the door of the building, and the one he assumed was the matron met him in a small room filled with some sofas and a bar. He assumed that it would be quite packed later during the evening, but now, midday, he and her were the only ones present. "Welcome to the Red Ruby. I am the matron Raya, how may we be of service?" And one needed to be very oblivious if one did not understand what service they offered. Even nowhere close to a brothel of any kind, the sultry tone and open question would clue most in. Robin let his gaze sweep over her exposed form appreciatively but managed to focus after a moment or two. "You wouldn't have a girl here that was more popular with the highborn, would you?" Robin asked, a little unsure of how he should formulate his question but committed now. Raya's striking blue eyes twinkled in amusement. "Darissa, darling, please come over here, it seems you have a new client," she called, and Robin soon heard shuffling from one of the rooms attached to the entrance lounge. A pale-skinned beauty with violet eyes and silver hair glided through one of the doors wearing only a transparent lilac dress and sandals on her womanly figure, not concealing anything, to be honest. Robin would not consider himself unknowing of women, he had been with some girls in Sow's Horn, and there was no waiting for marriage, at least in their minds. There had not been very many whores frequenting Sow's Horn, admittedly, but he had seen his fair share of camp followers at Harrenhal. None matched this girl's beauty, that was for sure. Her mother never was forthcoming of the father, the matron said with a look at Darissa before returning her gaze to Robin. But considering her colouring and the fact that our dear king had a period at the start of his marriage with Queen Raella where it happened he frequented other beds, it is no great mystery. "I am sure you will be pleased," Darissa bowed in greeting before taking his hand and guiding him. "Come here, sir, we can take this room," she said in a breathy tone. "How come you knew I was a knight?" Robin asked curiously. He was after all not only here for pleasure but also with a purpose. She fixed him with an amused look. "Well, a lord would never ask for the most popular among the highborn, and a commoner would not dare ask. Leaving you a hedge knight," she finished before sending a sultry smile. "I cannot imagine what bravery and gallantry you displayed to earn a knighthood." It was quite convincing, and Robin almost smiled in response, but his mind soon caught up and halted it. Her now amused eyes again told him that it was a wise choice if he wanted to keep his wits about him. They soon arrived in a room, and Darissa left him on the bed before turning and displaying her impressive backside as she walked away, closing the door and lighting some candles on a shelf beside the door with some curious holes in the wall behind them. "So, how do you want to start, good sir?" Darissa eventually inquired with her hands clasped in front of her waist. Bringing attention to her lower regions, it, at least, did so for Robin, and he paused before glancing down at his now straining breeches. Darissa caught on quickly as she approached with a sultry smile. "With or without my dear dress, sir?" "Without, but I did want," he interrupted himself as her dress fell in a pile by her feet. Now nothing was concealing any fraction of her curvy figure. She had most certainly been blessed by all the gods, and in his eyes, she was not missing anything in any department. A divine figure in some ways, he only got more excited and less focused as she got on her knees in front of him and began loosening his breeches. The breeches were swiftly dragged off his legs, and his mind went fuzzy when her mouth enveloped his manhood. It seemed his proposition would have to wait for a less addled mind. It had been a long time since he had been with a woman, and this vision of beauty was apparently not too wise to let handle his libido. Her violet eyes were focused on his even as she bobbed up and down on his length. He closed his eyes, if only to last a moment longer, but the sensations were still there, and he spilled soon enough. She was completely unsurprised by his release and swallowed it swiftly. Her sultry disposition had not disappeared but now returned in full force. "I am yours to command, sir," she stated, and his manhood twitched in her hand as she spoke. It had grown soft, but Robin greatly doubted that this would be the case for long. He shook his head as he crawled back into the bed and leaned up toward the headboard. She followed and eventually ended up between his legs attempting to coax him for round 2. Well, succeeding to coax him, he conceded. She looked at him questioningly, and he gestured to his lap and now second wind. It was a doomed battle, he knew, but he would fight nonetheless. Though as she crawled up with her lower lips soon dragging atop his cock, he questioned how long this battle would be. As she lowered herself down on him, he finally remembered his main goal of this expedition and held her still when she was fully sheathed. She had begun moaning wantonly but stopped when his hands came to her waist. "How would you like to make some coins on the side? Even some gold dragons if you do a good enough job," Robin managed to say as he still was fully aware of the warm muscles massaging his member. She looked at him again in amusement, obviously not used to so much conversation. "What? Fuck lords and receive a gold dragon if I impress, you would be a little too late for that," she gestured before gaining a seductive smile on her plump lips. "Or would I smother haughty lords with my tits?" she said as she leaned forward and pressed her impressive breasts in his face. He was completely surprised by the move, but she soon relented and began slowly humping his member instead with laughter in her eyes. "Well, I wouldn't want these lords to die with a smile on their faces," Robin eventually said in return. "No, what I would be interested in is information. If you managed to gain some information, any information, and relayed this to me or one of my men, I would be willing to pay you a healthy amount of silver stags." He seemed to have gained her attention as she stopped her agonizingly slow humping and grew thoughtful. "If you were to find some particularly useful or interesting information on a prominent lord, then I have a chest full of golden dragons at my disposition and completely free to take a few of them. Provided, of course, it is valuable to me." Darissa remained silent for some moments. "Well, the matron would not be pleased if we were found out, but it would be nice to earn some extra coins," she contemplated it aloud. "Of course, it would be nice to have additional coins." Robin sincerely doubted any lowborn would not be highly interested in some extra coin. Some were paid reasonably, but who would say no to being able to feed their family for a whole winter without uncertainty? Robin could at least not envision such a commoner. "Very well, I will be willing to do this, but if you walk back on your word, be sure that no whore on this side of the city will be fooled if you try," Darissa warned fiercely before calming. "What is your name?" she asked, and he blinked. "Robin, though I am probably better known by Sir Robin of Harrenhal," he answered a little hesitantly. He was not yet used to his new title but was pleased when her eyes widened. "You were one of the men knighted by the king?" she asked in some shock. He was surprised she had heard. "I'm surprised it has reached all the way here, but yes, I and my cousin," he replied before groaning as she shifted on his shaft. "Impressive," she purred, and he smiled in return with a degree of exasperation. He suddenly grabbed her by the side and rolled them over. She breathed heavily but didn't react otherwise. "I would be greatly appreciative if you extended this offer to some of the other popular whores in this establishment for me. I assure you it will not affect your salary other than possibly positively, of course." "I will do so. Now, however, are you planning to prove something or will we just lay here?" she asked with some humor, though he also detected some annoyance. He didn't respond with words. Adam rapped his iron cudgel on the door before him. Panicked movement sounded from within, prompting him to step back, allowing two of his men to attempt to break down the shoddy door. It wouldn't take long. In the meantime, he gestured for other watchmen to move to the back of the building, cutting off an escape for the criminals within. 3 men jogged off into an alleyway that hugged the side of the building. While his recent tasks lacked excitement, he and Christopher had proven themselves as the best sergeants in the West Barracks. Consequently, they were swiftly moved from simple guard assignments at the gates and walls to making arrests and breaking up criminal rings operating in the northern parts of the city. For 7 moons, they toiled tirelessly, their efforts evident in the transformation of Cobbler's Square and its surrounding districts into the safest corners of the entire city. Remarkably, these areas stood as rare havens untouched by the grip of criminal gangs. Had it not been for their seemingly indifferent commander, Adam was convinced that this success could have extended to the other 2 barracks. Unfortunately, under the leadership of Sir Arnold, concerns about the city's safety took a backseat to the whims of a commander more preoccupied with mock jousts and the politically charged replacement of competent captains at the gates with his own connections and those of his grandfather. Today, driven by a tip from one of Robin's whores, they were acting on intelligence suggesting a small band of amateur cutpurses holed up in this particular building. Once again, their sources seemed reliable, which once again was another notch in the post for Robin's scheme. Adam had been skeptical when the younger man had informed them of his plan, but he had let Christopher either approve it or not. This had proved to be a smart decision. Robin's scheme, a stroke of brilliance, proved one of their best decisions. Through Robin and Christopher's network, they had the city's pulse, from Flea Bottom's rumors to the Red Keep's High Lords. Robin's web, including Grand Maester Pycelle's odd requests and Lord Simon Staunton's quirks, kept Adam hooked. The Grand Maester's liking for silver-haired girls and Lord Staunton's mushroom reliance were very interesting. That the Master of Laws, Lord Staunton especially, barely could function without daily use of mushrooms almost didn't surprise him, considering the incompetence and corruption he had witnessed in the Magisters and Gold Cloaks ranks. Revelations about Maiden's exploits lost their novelty, however. Exposing them wouldn't advance their goals, but insights into the Grand Maester and Lord Staunton stayed in mind. As the door crashed, dust filling the air, Adam's men readied cudgels and shields. Unfazed, they stormed the house. Adam, flanked by vigilant companions forming a rearguard, pressed on. The air hummed with anticipation as they entered, ready for the challenges within. Some of the thieves found themselves caught mid-preparation to conceal within the small room, freezing at the sight of Adam's men raising their hefty cudgels and demanding compliance. Panic set in, prompting a scramble as the criminals desperately attempted to evade the imminent threat. Those who chose reason were swiftly dragged past the forward guards by the rearguard, secured with tight ropes binding their hands and feet. However, not all were inclined towards reason. Some, fueled by desperation, opted to flee. Their attempt was promptly met with the unyielding force of his guards' iron cudgels, the dried blood on the weapons serving as a stark reminder of their effectiveness. The air filled with the screams of those who had underestimated the resolve of Adam's men, their surrender coming swiftly as they crumpled to the ground. From another room, his men who had flanked around emerged, 4 thieves leading the way. One of the men reported, "Managed to catch them all, sir." Slippery lot, but none could evade Lyle's cudgel, as Lyle proudly displayed his bloodied weapon. Adam nodded approvingly. "Good work. Keep the thieves here with the rear guard, and then we'll scour this damned house from top to bottom for any stolen goods." The search unveiled a trove of stolen goods, ranging from pouches of coins to more lavish treasures like expensive furs and Dornish spices. It was evident these thieves were more than mere cutpurses, likely having accosted a merchant or two to amass such a variety of valuables. Soon, all the men reconvened, goods in hand, surrounding the apprehended thieves. Pointing towards a group nearest to the prisoners, 3 from the rearguard and an additional member, Adam issued orders. "You 4 will be escorting the prisoners to the cells and reporting them to the Magisters." It wasn't a duty any watchman relished, the process could be tedious, and the company of the prisoners far from pleasant. His men, though, accepted the task. It took some stern warnings and displays of authority to instill discipline, but Adam knew the importance of treating his men fairly and with respect, cultivating loyalty and dedication within his squad. "The rest of you will take custody of these goods for the crown and deposit them at the barracks treasury," Adam instructed before stepping out of the building into the warm sunlight filtering between the houses of King's Landing. He was confident his men would carry out the orders diligently. His steps naturally led him toward the barracks. After 7 moons, he had grown intimately acquainted with most parts of the city, patrolling its streets both day and night. In the northern sections, under the jurisdiction of the West Barracks, Gold Cloaks were regarded as staunch upholders of the law and keepers of the peace, a reputation solidified by the influences of Adam and Christopher. With no tolerance for corruption, they rooted out any misconduct among their fellow officers. Most fellow sergeants in their barracks were either individuals they had placed trust in, successfully persuading Lieutenant Lucas to replace corrupt counterparts or those inspired by their unwavering example. Those who weren't fell in line either through inspiration or fear of the consequences. Adam knew that Christopher had contacted Prince Rhaegar about the promotion to lieutenant, and while the prince had assured them he was trying to move this into place from the shadows, there hadn't really been any results yet. Their captain of the gate, Sir Ronald Penrose, was very experienced, a little too experienced in some ways, and hadn't lost his posting yet only because Sir Arnold Merryweather had his hands full trying to not have the gold cloaks of his new captains mutiny against their new commanding officers. Adam couldn't fathom what Sir Arnold expected when he replaced respected or long-serving officers with his associates. The Reacher Knight's actions kept him occupied, even though Sir Arnold, barely 20 name days old, lacked extensive experience himself. As Adam passed through the streets, the men and women of the small folk almost bowed to him, allowing him to proceed unhindered. It felt peculiar, yet he acknowledged that, unlike most nobles, he had earned the respect. He carried himself with pride back to the barracks. An eyebrow arched in confusion as Adam observed 2 watchmen stationed at the entrance to the barracks. "Come with us, sir. Captain Ronald requests your presence," one of them stated, neither being part of Adam's or Christopher's contingent. Adam nodded and followed the 2 up a flight of stairs leading to the captain's quarters. In the West Barracks, with 4 captains stationed, the captain of the Gate of the Gods held the highest rank, overseeing the other 3 captains who, in turn, answered to him. Captain Penrose then reported directly to the commander. Upon reaching Sir Ronald's quarters, Adam entered as the door swung open for him. Immediately, his attention was drawn to the presence of both Lieutenant Lucas Stone and Christopher. Seated behind the desk was the seasoned form of the senior captain. Christopher maintained a neutral expression, offering a nod of acknowledgement to Adam. "Sergeant Adam, welcome. We can now begin." The captain's raspy voice carried a lingering strength despite the passage of time. Having not interacted much with the captain outside of the mess hall, Adam couldn't discern the purpose behind this summons. The air in the room held a sense of formality, sparking a curiosity that lingered in his expression. As Adam stood in line beside Christopher, the captain seized a scroll from his desk. "I have received a direct dispatch from the Master of Laws," the aged knight disclosed, prompting Adam's eyebrow to instinctively raise. The mention of the Master of Laws, given what Adam had gleaned about the man, sounded unusual. "This has apparently completely bypassed Commander Merryweather, promoting you, Lieutenant Stone, as the new captain of the Lion Gate. The dismissal of one of my other lieutenants, which I was not informed of, and the promotion of both of you for your exemplary service to the rank of my now open positions as lieutenants." The captain relayed the information with an emotionless tone, though a flicker of annoyance seemed to lurk in the Stormlander's eyes. "It seems all too incredibly convenient, but I will soon be off to parchments or the hands of the stranger, whichever comes first, so what do I care?" the Penrose finished, irritation evident. "I have not missed your accomplishments either, and I will be expecting the same in your positions as lieutenants." Dismissed. The captain's annoyance lingered as they saluted and left the room. Lucas wore a blank expression, while Christopher displayed a small, satisfied smile, growing more pronounced the farther they got from the solar. "This was your doing, was it not? I am aware of your friends in high places," Lucas suddenly asked, and Christopher nodded. "I do not agree with your methods, but Captain of the Lion Gate is the second most important position in the Watch, so I am thankful. Do not attempt to involve me again," Lucas finished, looking conflicted as he stalked away. "How did you convince Prince Rhaegar?" Adam inquired quietly, glancing at Christopher, who responded with a smirk. "A certain supply of medicinal mushrooms was threatened, which the Master of Laws was very eager to protect," Christopher divulged. "And you informed our patron of this?" Adam asked, curiosity etched on his face. Christopher nodded. Adam couldn't help but recognize the hypocrisy in their actions, given their usual intolerance of corruption. However, he had long understood that there were few boundaries Christopher wouldn't cross to achieve his aspirations. Blackmailing one of the king's closest advisors was undoubtedly their most audacious move yet. Adam couldn't deny the mix of nerves and relief coursing through him, acknowledging the advantage of having Prince Rhaegar as an ally up there in the castle. With the personal loyalty of 18 more watchmen from their 2 squads, individuals who might soon be eyeing promotions to replace the remaining sergeants following them out of fear, their influence and power had grown once again.